time is now 6:30, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. My name is Carson and I'm the museum assistant and educator here at the Lacey Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's history talk. Now, before we begin this evening's presentation, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The museum is on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Nisqually and Squaxin Island people. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as part of the city of Lacey, we work with the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in a government-to-government partnership. Now, before we hear Dr. Kyle Kinoshita's presentation, I'd like to share some museum news and updates with you all. Maybe. Let's try that again. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. I would like to share that our museum is open. We are open Thursdays and Fridays from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. and Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So if you're interested, make sure you come on by. Either myself or one of our wonderful volunteers would be more than happy to give you a tour of any of our exhibits that we have on display. And speaking of exhibits, we currently have 2 temporary exhibits on display. They're going to be on display at the museum through April 30th. The first one is all about women's suffrage in Washington State. It is called From Parlor to Podium. And we also have a fun tabletop program that goes along with it to teach everyone about suffrage here in Washington State. So that's our first temporary exhibit we have. And then the second temporary exhibit we have is called Righting a Wrong, Japanese Americans in World War II. And this is a Smithsonian traveling poster exhibit. And again, both of these exhibits are going to be on display through April 30th. So if you're interested, make sure you stop by the Lacey Museum to see these before they're gone. In addition, some more Lacey Museum news. We also have some volunteer positions that have opened up at the Lacey Museum. Our volunteers do a wide variety of tasks, from greeting guests, giving tours, helping with museum projects, all sorts of things. So if you're interested, please visit the Lacey Museum website to fill out an application, or feel free to stop by the Lacey Museum to pick up a hard copy of a paper application as well, if you're interested in volunteering with us. And then before we begin tonight's history talk, I do want to share that our next history talk is scheduled for Wednesday, April 13th at 6:30 p.m. And the presentation is called Destination Gwenwood. And I'm going to go ahead and read a description about this. So the description for Destination Gwenwood is: on the southwestern shores of Hicks Lake, a camp and conference center retains the name Gwenwood from its resort glory days. Join our museum curator, Erin Quinn Velcho, to find out about the tragedy and triumphs of its namesake, Gwen Hicks, discover the most famous visitors, and learn how the site came to be owned by the Western Washington Christian churches. So if you guys are interested in also joining us for this history talk, we have the link on our events page on our website, as well as there are registration links on the City of Lacey's Facebook page as well. And for tonight's presentation, we are going to have our Q&A section at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions that you think of, go ahead and click that Q&A button. It's usually located at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. All right, I think those are all the updates I had. So it is my honor to introduce you to our wonderful speaker today, Dr. Kyle Kinoshita. Dr. Kyle Kinoshita is a career PK-12 educator, having been a teacher and principal and a school district leader. He is currently an educational leadership consultant and, make sure I say this right, affiliate faculty member in the Principal Preparation Program at the University of Washington, Bothell. Dr. Kinoshita is also a 2022 co-president of the Seattle chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. He grew up in a diverse neighborhood on Beacon Hill in South Seattle, where his interest in racial equity and social justice began. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Great, okay.
Hand it over to you.
Sounds good. And I'll set myself up here with my presentation and my Zoom. Okay, here we go. There. Okay. Thank you, Carson, for the very nice introduction. And it is actually an honor to, present to you. I'm always a little kind of in awe that anyone might be kind of interested in this story, but I suppose it kind of is. So going through the presentation, Carson did a great job introducing me. I am a product of the Seattle API community, and as you can probably guess, a descendant of a family who was incarcerated during World War II. So in terms of the presentation, a part of this is a narrative of what happened to 120,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of whom were US citizens by birthright. And I know many people by now know at least parts of the story, but part of the story is a story told through the eyes of two family members who experienced incarceration, their reflections and decisions they made as a result of what happened to them. And you'll learn more about them as I go along. George Sawada is one family member, and Sherry Tanaka Kinoshita is the other. And yes, that is my mom. And probably at the end, I'll explain why I put that quote at the beginning. So to start the story here, hang on here, there's one detail I have to do just in case. Okay. I always have to check to make sure that I followed Zoom etiquette and pressed a couple of buttons. So in any case, the early history of my family before World War II was pretty illustrative of historical narrative in existence at a time for many Asian Americans immigrating to the US. So this is my grandfather. And when I went on Ancestry.com, and found his immigration papers, I saw that he had come to the United States in order to work on the railroad, probably railroad construction. So like many Asian immigrants who came to work at hard jobs at cheap wages, oftentimes they escaped the backbreaking work and entered into various other occupations. So this is a picture of him in his dry cleaning shop, which is very close to the Green Lake neighborhood here in Seattle. So by the time he came in 1905, the narrative that Asian immigrants were disposable cheap labor to be used and sent back to their homeland was already pretty well established with the Chinese and their exclusion. So there are already in place anti-Asian laws preventing them from owning land or marrying outside their race. They were considered to be permanently undesirable. They carried disease, they took jobs from Americans, and were generally a threat. They also had to deal with a racist immigration system. So when my grandmother, who was still in Japan, tried to join my grandfather in the US in 1907, which was the first year of restrictions to Japanese immigration, she found it so difficult, the family story goes, that she left their firstborn son with relatives, which turned out to be a permanent and rather unhappy arrangement. So what you read in the paper about family separation resulting because of immigration policies, that's not really a new thing. The other thing is, despite the fact that my grandparents wanted to settle here and make a life here, American citizenship was closed to them. In 1922, the US Supreme Court reaffirmed definitively that only white Europeans were allowed to naturalize, and people from Japan and other countries were considered to be of the Mongoloid race and therefore ineligible to naturalize for citizenship. So this is my mom, born in 1923, a year after that Supreme Court decision, which kind of defined their reality at that time. And you see her, that's the Lincoln High School, Seattle annual. And there she is an American-born citizen high school graduate in 1941, kind of an all-American girl. And she's thinking about wanting to go to college, getting a college degree, and kind of pursuing the American dream. Only problem is that dry cleaning doesn't make a lot of money. And so she was trying to think of ways, how could she raise money for tuition? She thought she had, a brilliant idea, which was that, she would go to secretarial school and learn some secretarial skills, get a job, earn money, save it, and go to school that way. So she went to the high school counselor with this idea, and the high school counselor kind of set her straight. She said, well, you could go ahead and do that, but you understand that no one is going to hire a Japanese girl for secretarial work. So that kind of illustrates the reality that prior to World War II, Asian Americans were just another group of despised brown people who needed to be kept in their place and excluded from various walks of life in a racist system. So a year later, my mom's problem was kind of moot because she found herself incarcerated in that particular camp. Her college dreams kind of blown up with Pearl Harbor. So what was it like back then? One of the things that is kind of fortunate and a resource for all of you, if you're curious, is that there's a website called densho.org. Densho is a Japanese word connoting preserving the legacy. And what you have here are hundreds of oral histories of Japanese Americans before they passed. My mom passed in 2008, which, collected all the recollections, what they were thinking and reflecting on. So there's more than an hour, but I'll show just a snippet to, sort of have you get a glimpse of what it was like at that time.
And do you remember what that day was like when you?
That was a Sunday, and I remember going to the drugstore, and I heard the newspaper boys. In those days, that when something broke, the newsboys would go out calling extra, extra, and then people would come out and buy it. And so they were. I would hear the newsboys, and so when I got back home, I said, something's happening, we should turn on the radio. And so we turned on the radio, and then, President Roosevelt was announcing, the day of infamy. And the thing that stands out on that day was to realize, in looking at my father, his whole demeanor changed. He was just crushed. And I guess I didn't realize what it meant to us to have the United States and Japan at war. It just didn't sink in that that was going to reflect on us. And so, but when I saw him and he said something to the effect that this is disastrous, then it began to sink in. This is not going to be a very happy time for us.
So he knew right away.
Oh, yeah.
There'd be repercussions.
In fact, I think through the newspapers and the news, these days were aware that war was approaching, and so they were fearful of that. So it wasn't a shock. It's something they did fear all along.
So that's one of many. And if you go to that website, you can also, listen to her talk about, pretty directly the experience, that she had. So just kind of moving along, so you know what she was thinking and feeling at the time. Now, not a lot happened in December afterward, but in January, a media campaign began in earnest. Their commentators and military leaders began a concerted campaign on the press and the radio. So in the media, there are many reports of espionage and sabotage by Japanese and Japanese Americans, including of helping the enemy at Pearl Harbor and on the West Coast, preparations to help a Japanese invasion of the mainland. The only trouble was that none of these were true. Both U.S. naval intelligence and the FBI at the time, who were on high alert, found that every single report was false. Further, the Roosevelt administration, in preparation for the eventual war in 1940, had commissioned a confidential large-scale study of the Japanese-American community, and it concluded that there was overwhelming loyalty to the U.S. and very limited sympathy to Japan. So my mom's brother, my uncle, and numerous other Japanese-American men on the West Coast and Hawaii already joined the U.S. Army even before Pearl Harbor. So the accounts of the presidential discussion about what to do about the Japanese-American community was subject, apparently, to a heated debate in the White House. Even then, some of FDR's advisors argued that this doing something like an incarceration would be a massive violation of the constitutional rights and kind of racist. But the military and other advisors were adamant in arguing for mass incarceration. FDR reportedly equivocated, but in the end, 80 years ago, on February 19th, 2 weeks ago, he signed Executive Order 9066, giving the U.S. Army the power to incarcerate anyone they deemed a security risk. So the executive order itself didn't mention Japanese Americans by name. It was pretty clear that the Army had a racial basis for what it was about to do. The justification was that there was a military danger of Japanese invasion, but there are others who didn't bother to conceal their motives. So this quote is from Austin Anson, and he's a California farmer, head of the Salinas Vegetable Grower Shipper Association, quoted in the Post, and I'll go ahead and read this real quickly. We're charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We might as well be honest. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives on the Pacific coast or the brown man. They came to this valley to work and they stayed to take over. They undersell the white men in the markets. They work their women and children while the white farmer has to pay wages for his help. If all the Japs were removed tomorrow, we'd never miss them in 2 weeks because white farmers can take over and produce everything the Jap grows. And we do not want them back when the war ends either. Picture on the right, on top, of course, is Bellevue, Washington. And Bellevue at that time, was pretty rural. And a lot of Japanese families had berry farms there. But Miller Freeman, who also lived in Bellevue, the Freemans who developed and still run Bellevue Square, had long been publicly advocating for sending the Japanese community back to Japan. And after Pearl Harbor, he renewed his calls. So what happened eventually was that, of course, the Japanese were removed and they lost their land. So if you go down to Bellevue and look at all the glittering Bellevue skyscrapers and Bellevue Square itself, it was built on Japanese land that was lost during the incarceration. So what you see are, farms and future shopping malls and many other places resulted from the removal of the Japanese American community. And you can see that there were quite a few who actually ended up profiting from the incarceration. So in March, probably around this time, the order came for the incarceration of Japanese Americans in Washington State, Oregon, and California. So by this time, the media campaign was in full force, which answers the question of why there wasn't too much of an outcry. It was even argued that the absence of espionage or sabotage was actually more proof that you couldn't trust Japanese Americans. Their racial characteristic of inscrutability just meant that they were waiting until Japan actually attacked the West Coast before they sprung into action. So in March, the Army put up, posters, and this is a one that was put up in Seattle, that basically said you had 1 week to register and then show up at Union Station in Seattle. So basically, 1 week to dispose everything and appear with 2 suitcases for each person that you could carry. So you think about this, what about your house, your car, your pets, everything else that you own? Essentially, the US government told Japanese Americans that as it was war, it was basically their problem. So in the Densho site, my mom talks about how hard it was to figure out what to take, as they were given no information as to where they were going. Was it going to be cold? Was it going to be hot? How long were they going to be gone? Did they need to take bedding or not? So basically, they had to put their entire life in 2 suitcases. So the bottom line, my family lost all their possessions except for what they had in their suitcases. And she said her account that basically they had to figure out how to get a ride to Union Station because they had to sell their car for a pittance. And she talked about the irony of trying to catch a ride, to actually go to your imprisonment. So on that day, the Japanese Americans would show up at Union Station. An entire Seattle community literally disappeared overnight. So as you can see from the empty desks at Bailey Gatzert, which is in the central area, it was very largely Japanese American in terms of their enrollment. So most Puget Sound residents were bused into the initial assembly area in the Puyallup Fairgrounds, which in true Orwellian fashion was named Camp Harmony, which was unfinished and unready. The photo at top left is a replica of hastily cleaned up and set up quarters in a building used for horse stalls. And it was cleaned up pretty well, except for the smell, apparently. And this is now a permanent exhibit now on the Washington Fairgrounds. My mom vividly remembers the first meal, cold canned beets with raw onions and Vienna sausages. The biggest shock to her as a naive 19-year-old was when they got off the bus. They'd been told, among other things, that the incarceration or evacuation, it was called, was because they faced the danger of an angry American public. Given what she'd seen in the months after Pearl Harbor, she half believed it. But she vividly recalls the shock in realizing that the machine guns in the guard towers were pointed inwardly at them, and the barbed wire fence was designed to keep people in and not out. In late summer of 1942, they were put on trains to go to this permanent camp near Minidoka, Idaho. And the map shows the military zone where Japanese Americans were cleared, which is approximately 100 miles from the coast, and the camps were inland. So this led to the absurdity of Japanese Americans who lived in this area surrounding the camp, walking completely scot-free, while inside, other Japanese Americans lived behind barbed wire. The new camp at Minidoka wasn't too much better than Camp Harmony. The per square foot allowance per person was less than that allotted for federal prisoners at that time. So after a few months, the camp of 10,000 had the ramshackle features of a small city. A school was organized with few materials. There was a hospital. The substandard care meant that there were deaths for normally curable illnesses. And even though it was in the desert in the winter, it would rain and snow, and you still had to walk outside in the mud or dust to go to the bathroom, shower, eat, or wash clothes. And as before, everyone, including kids, were shut in by barbed wire fences. So it's against this backdrop that we reflect on the thoughts of the first family member, George Katsuya Sawada, who was an uncle by marriage, raised in Seattle, like my mom, a graduate of Franklin High School and University of Washington. He dreamed of a medical career, going to medical school. And because he was older than my mom, he didn't have a naive response to the incarceration. In fact, he related later that he descended in extreme bitterness, hatred, and anger at America with opportunities robbed from him because of racism. But what was kind of curious, a year later, he had a change of heart that led him to make another choice and decision. In February 1943, a year after they're incarcerated, George Sawada and several thousand others volunteer out of Minidoka and the other incarceration camps for the U.S. Army. He enlisted to become a member of an all-Japanese American regiment after the Army finally admitted that the Japanese Americans were indeed loyal. So what turned this bitter young man around? What was going through the minds of men like George, wrestling with the irony of fighting for the country who had blatantly subjected them to racism and incarcerated them? Now, George actually left a written record. It was an emotional letter written to his father as soon as he had gotten on the troop train to basic training in Mississippi. It was a letter, he said, that was outside the bounds of what a normally reserved Japanese American would say to his father. He spoke of his earlier bitterness at how Italian and German Americans did not get the same treatment as theirs. And he spoke about how his father had expressed his love for America, despite the racism that he faced, despite the denial of a chance to be a naturalized citizen, and despite the fact that incarceration meant that he lost everything. His father's love was made deeper because it was here that his wife, George's mother, had died and was buried in Seattle. George talks in his letter about him being so moved by his father's steadfastness that he eventually came around to decide that his responsibility as an American to defend democracy against fascism outweighed the racism that he, his family, his community faced. He ended the letter pledging to come back to his family, having proven himself. So George, following his aspirations to go into medicine, became a combat medic in the all-Nisei 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And if you read about it, there are a number of interesting books, including one book called Facing the Mountain by Daniel Brown, who also wrote a book about the UW rowing team. In any case, that book just came out, which you could read about their exploits. They immediately distinguished themselves fighting the Nazis in Italy and France, and eventually became the most decorated unit of its size in American history, obviously, as they had something to prove. On July 4th, near Livorno, Italy, Sergeant Sawada's squad went to front lines through territory thought to have been captured in intense fighting the day before. He volunteered to take the point position, though he was a medic. And he was shot and killed by a German sniper at 8 p.m. that evening. So this was one of the many hard choices forced on those who were on the camps. Some, like George, joined to prove that Japanese Americans were loyal. Others, when the draft was reinstated for men who were still incarcerated, chose to resist and were thrown into federal penitentiary. There were bitter feelings in the Japanese American community for decades after that between the two sides. In hindsight, our community to this day is still healing, and we're coming to understand both stands and to see that it was the US government that was the real culprit here, that it forced the hard choices on the people in these camps. My mom also reflected deeply among the dust and cold in the barracks living. This is a picture of my mom here and there. She got a job earning a tiny amount of money writing for the camp's newspaper because she had been on the high school newspaper staff when she was at Lincoln. So believe it or not, my mom said at first there was a part of her that still went along because after all it was war and you had to make some sacrifices. But their treatment and the irony of Japanese American soldiers putting their lives on the line for America wasn't lost on her at a certain point. One day she remembers sitting at the typewriter and thinking of the freedom that all other Americans enjoyed and the brothers or friends who were killed in action. And it finally struck her like a tidal wave about the injustice of it all. There is no evidence they'd done anything wrong except have the physical appearance of that enemy. She was supposed to write a lighthearted woman's haircut article, but instead she wrote an essay about the liberties that had been taken away from them. So after the war, they rebuilt a life from nothing. They were given $25 upon the release from camp, and sometimes a hostile reception back when they went to the West Coast. She married my dad and made a living, him fixing cars and her doing various secretary type jobs, which wasn't what she had in mind when she had hoped for a college education. But slowly, families like mine made it into the middle class, and the model minority narrative began to take hold in the Japanese American community. That's where you work hard, assimilate, and become white American as much as possible. Most of all, you be quiet, grateful, and whatever you do, don't ever complain about racism, past or present, and don't go out in the streets like other minorities to protest racism. But Seattle in the 50s and 60s was pretty segregated. Asians and Blacks were redlined in the central area. So it shouldn't be surprised that many Japanese Americans witnessed the rise of the civil rights movement, including that in Seattle, and begin to sympathize with it. So in 1970, a small group of Nisei got to talking, including my mom. Numerous members of the younger generation growing up in the 60s weren't buying the model minority narrative and were themselves politically active in a variety of anti-racist and anti-war causes. They didn't have the experience of the incarceration or the trauma that went with it. Now, this particular group of older Nisei didn't recoil, especially when they also continued to see anti-Asian racism and microaggressions in the newfound professions they were allowed into in the 60s. They also had their memories, which only occurred about 20 years before. They said to themselves, we can't forget what happened. There has to be some kind of justice out of this. So they put their idea out to the community. They called the effort a movement for redress. Redress is a word used in the First Amendment in the Constitution, which indicates the right of Americans to seek resolution for government wrongs. So the initial reaction was many did not like it at all. A lot of Japanese Americans were fearful and angry at stirring up the past and terrified that there'd be another wave of racism against them for raising the issue. And to make matters worse, in 1977, Senator S.I. Hayakawa, a conservative Republican who wasn't even in the camps, he was a Japanese Canadian who had rode out the war in Chicago. He wrote an op-ed that appeared in national newspapers about how stupid these Seattle Nisei, and he named them by name, were, accusing of them being kind of like their infantile woke children. The op-eds, of course, interestingly enough, had the opposite effect. Most of the American public had actually never heard of incarceration. And throughout the 70s, incarceration slowly became an interesting human interest story, kind of like a 60-minute style news piece. There are books and even a made-for-TV movie was made about it, which started to gain the sympathy of the general public for the previously unknown story. But the movement for redress after 8 years seemed to stall. So in 1978, a group in Seattle organized the first day of Remembrance, which is now celebrated every February 19th, which is the anniversary of FDR signing Executive Order 9066. So they organized basically a caravan from Seattle to Puyallup and a rally there. To the complete shock of the organizers, a lot of people they didn't expect showed up. They were hoping that maybe 500 showed up. And the number was actually 3,300 that eventually appeared in Puyallup. My mom thought at the time that she realized that the Japanese American community had left behind the fear instilled by the model minority narrative. By 1979, Mike Lowry, who was a congressman, liberal congressman from the 7th District in Seattle, was ready to introduce a bill for reparations into Congress. But there was a setback. Instead of considering the bill, US Congress decided to instead set up a fact-finding committee to decide whether the incarceration was justified or not. This would take years, and there were some Nisei organizers who were so furious that they actually quit in disgust the effort. And they were angry because of the fact that many elderly Issei were dying off and would never see justice or compensation for this. That's when Sherry Kinoshita stepped forward among the group of Nisei and started to take the lead. She realized that if you had a commission, you had public hearings. If you had public hearings, you had public testimony. And she then realized that this is the perfect opportunity for the community to share their never told stories. So she contacted and mobilized JCL chapters around the country, and she contacted churches and other community organizations and recruited dozens of Seattle community members to speak. Across the country, 750 Japanese Americans testified. They'd never been heard before because Japanese Americans were the quiet, successful minority group who never complained about racism. In city after city, they were calm and quiet in the 5 minutes that they were allotted, but they let their words have the power. He talked to family members disappearing for years after the FBI picked them up, not knowing their fate, of complete loss of houses, farms, businesses, precious possessions, of relatives dying in childbirth because of the lack of health care, being buried in the desert in unmarked graves. And most of all was the deep trauma and shame endured in silence, that is, until the hearings. Cherry is credited as one of those who stepped up to mobilize the community to make sure these stories actually finally saw the light of day. After the efforts of my mom and many others, and after the committee had gone through thousands of pages of documents from that time, such as when it was revealed that the US Army had suppressed reports on the FBI and US Navy that Japanese Americans had not had a single instance of sabotage or espionage, a report was issued. These were the findings that went to Congress. Basically, that there was never any question of a military necessity, that essentially was a complete lie, that the incarceration stemmed solely from race prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a lack of political will from politicians who should have known better. And these were the recommendations. So this settled the question once and all that the incarceration was never a necessity. But it took another 4 years of furious lobbying, speaking, testimony, and community organizing by my mom, and many others, and to get the bill on the floor of Congress. In August of 1988, 9 years after the bill was first considered, and 18 years after the idea was first entertained by Seattle and other Nisei, the bill passed out of Congress and went to President Ronald Reagan to sign or veto. Now, those of you who are old enough to remember, Reagan was a Republican enemy of big government and big spending, and the bill was to cost $2 billion. Conservatives railed against the cost of the redress bill, and he too was opposed to it at first. But why was it that he eventually signed, and gladly so? When the bill passed out of Congress, the California Nisei contacted him and reminded him that the president that in 1945, as an Army captain, he presided over the funeral of a Nisei soldier who'd sacrificed his life to protect fellow soldiers, but whose family was still in a camp. He related later that it was this memory that changed his mind. So my mom's in the front row of that picture, the signing in the audience, having worked and dreamed the entire 18 years. On the way, she initiated and led the team of 3 other local redress spells for Japanese Americans at the state, city, and school district level. When asked later, why was it that she persisted for all these years when she just could have enjoyed the middle-class status that she'd attained after the war? She said from that time she reflected in camp as a 19-year-old, she could not rest until this injustice was resolved. She said this country stood for something and it had to live up to its ideals, that it was the right thing to do. So basically, in some ways, that's the end of the story, almost. In 1984, when she was 60, she finally got what she was trying to earn money for by being a secretary in 1941. A simple college degree, BA in sociology with honors. So in addition to this, she earned an award from the Japanese consulate for service to the community and the Washington State Jefferson Award in 2004. Now at this point, if she were still alive, I'd be getting a major scolding for not naming the many, many other Nisei and Sansei who were also instrumental in redress. But the former congressman and later Governor Mike Lowry, who nominated her for the Jefferson Award, called her the driving force for redress and justice for the past racism against the Japanese American community. She also became part of a community legacy of strong Japanese American women of her generation who refused to conform to the stereotype of the quiet Japanese American women. The others, Michi Weglin, Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga, who was the one who had discovered in the government records a cover-up of the army, Yuri Kochiyami, Aki Kuroshi, all helped with redress, and both Aki and Yuri were also figures who were prominent in the movement for Black civil rights in their communities. So why does any of this matter 80 years after the fact? In my mind, it's an American story, not a Japanese American story. And it has to do with who is an American, who gets to be treated as one. Constitution of the United States says that people in all of these pictures are equal. They're American citizens because they were born here, and that the government can't imprison them without due process. But born here, or citizens or not, people have rights, both constitutional and human. So today, these lessons apply to Muslim Americans, communities vilified after 9/11, or those in detention along the southern border, or the Asian Americans who are being attacked literally in the past 2 years because of the China virus narrative. The Japanese American story is a textbook case about how a people can be vilified and excluded and receive racist treatment by those who are powerful. And these are lessons that we need to learn today. So in my opinion, that's why our family is resonant and still rings true after 80 years. So at this point, I'll stop because that's the story. And I got the Q&A open. Jim Grant submitted a question about Japanese business and landowners who lost their property when they're sent to camps. Were there any Japanese citizens to return their homes to find them intact with continuing title to their property and business, or did everyone lose everything? In fact, I would say the majority of Japanese families did lose everything. However, kind of a happy ending for the father side of the family. The father side of the family actually came from the Portland area, Gresham, and they were berry farmers. They actually leased their land and they were able to find a Filipino family who actually took care of the farm while they were gone. And so they were one of the lucky ones who were able to return back after the war and resume farming. But many others didn't get that opportunity. Like my grandfather, basically, by the time he got back, he was basically ready for retirement. And so that's how I remember him, as someone who was, you know, a little bit kind of broken by the war and, you know, kind of angry about what had happened. So are there any other questions or comments or anything that people want to observe?
I just want to pop in and ask our audience again, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And I had a question for you, Dr. Kinoshita.
Sure.
So thank you to start off with for the presentation. It was definitely insightful and definitely brought, I think, a good conversation. But my question for you is, you have a lot of information. So if anyone in our audience was interested in learning even more about this topic, where would you recommend them go to find more information or to hear more of those oral histories?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think going to Densho is a pretty amazing site because not only does it have, you know, many articles, a lot of photos of the camp experience, the most incredible thing are the oral histories of, you know, some of these folks who are like my mom, incarcerated, or, you know, went on to fight for redress. There are many stories of Japanese American veterans who were in the 442 and what they remember. So I think, you know, that is one place. The Wing Luke Museum here in Seattle has an exhibit as well. And, you know, contacting, you know, us at the Japanese American Citizens League, because of the fact that we have other kinds of information. We just put together, interestingly enough, the Japanese American Citizens League in Seattle is actually 100 years old. It was started in 1921 by some Nisei, that is second generation, who were concerned about the anti-Asian laws and the racial prejudice. And so we, as a project, developed basically their display boards, you know, which set up that tell the history of Japanese American Citizens League, including the incarceration and redress. So there are a couple other sources that will come to mind that I'll think of in a minute. But in any case, I see another question. When people were being taken away to the camps, did some fear they'd be killed like the Jews? Absolutely. They had no sense, and the government was not telling them anything about what their fate was going to be. And you had folks like Miller Freeman who were advocating that they all be put on a boat to Japan. And of course, you had others who, you know, wanted to do some more dire things. There were not too many cases, but there were some Japanese Americans who were killed as a result of being in camp. You know, one case of a man who I think suffered from dementia, walked toward the fence, and a guard shot and killed him. There were other instances where it appears that there is sentiment to actually do that. One of the interesting stories from the redress that my mom had led and obtained was from the effort for getting redress from the Seattle School District. There are 27 very young Japanese American women school clerks. And in January, they were all kind of brought to the Seattle School District headquarters and said, you know, is there patriotic duty to resign? But if you didn't resign, we'd probably fire you anyway. So they resigned. 1984, during the effort for redress, The Seattle School Board meeting where the bill was put up to a vote attracted quite a few veterans and other folks from various parts of the community who disrupted the meeting, saying that these Japanese Americans were the enemy and they didn't deserve a thing. One comment was heard at the end of the meeting saying, "We should have lynched you in Puyallup while we had the chance." So clearly that sort of sentiment was out there. Okay, so you're welcome. I appreciate getting the opportunity to tell the story. And the question is how the experience affected me as an individual. Well, that's kind of interesting. My mother was kind of an unusual woman. There were a lot of Nisei. By the way, I forgot to explain the term. Issei is the Japanese term for those who emigrated from Japan. Nisei was the name for their children who were born here in the US, and I'm a sansei. Now, if you know Japanese, ichi ni san basically is the name of the generation. So many of the Nisei were so traumatized that they never said anything to their kids, my generation, about the camps. And the sansei, some of these sansei only found out later through hearing about it in a book or something like that. My mom was a little unusual. She kind of sat me down because they kept on talking about camp this and camp that. And I think I must have thought that, they'd taken a vacation, that they hadn't bothered to bring me along. So I finally asked, what's this camp thing? So she sat me down and told me. And I can't remember being maybe 8 or 9, but just completely blown away to think that this had happened to my family. So I tend to think that what it clearly has done, I think, not just to me, but I think for the community, that what might be normally kind of a fairly conservative and traditional community in a lot of ways has a pretty clear bent towards sympathy for social justice and toward going into fields that actually, allow us to exercise that, or even if you are in a field that is fairly traditional, to basically take opportunities to speak out. There are many who help with Redress, but today there are many of us who sympathize with, after 9/11, the treatment that Muslim Americans had. I remember being a principal of an elementary school at the time, and there was an Iraqi refugee family whose father was just incredibly afraid of what was going to happen to the kids. And I was able to sit him down and say, I think I kind of understand what your fears are. And, I promise to do everything possible to make your kids feel safe and secure while they're in school. So, thanks for the good questions. Oops, I noticed that I haven't gone quite down all the way down to the Q&A box here. Okay, hang on, my cursor's disappeared. Another thing I learned about doing PowerPoint is that you actually have to click something so your cursor doesn't disappear. There you go. All right. Oh, website in the chat box. Okay, if you give me a second, I will do that. And Debbie, thank you for that memory. Portland was another area that was pretty active in support of Redress. So, appreciate, you remembering. Okay, so let me see here. Let me see if I can do this kind of quickly here. I'm going to exit and see whether I can quickly pull up that website without losing something or breaking something here. Hang on here. Okay. There we go. Okay, let me see here. Let me see. It is actually densho.org. What I'm going to do is, this is my mom's page. I'm going to go to basically the home page to get the actual. And okay, so let me see. Q&A, type answer. Okay, this is actually the first time I've actually ever used the Q&A. There we go. And just to maybe quickly show you just a few things. You know, you can browse. There are many testimonials and, you know, many artifacts, you know, from the camps. That's a picture of Aki Kuroshi, by the way. This is Rudy Tokiwa, oops, who this is Guy Rudy Tokiwa, you know, someone who I talk about. He was a veteran in 442 and has some incredible stories.
I don't mean to interrupt. I don't think you're sharing the screen for the website.
Yes, that is absolutely right. And you reminded me of that very thing that I have to be reminded about once a presentation. There we go. Okay, and that's a presentation here. And that's a picture of Rudy right there. You know, so you can actually click his story and, you know, hear about some of his exploits in Italy and France. Okay, let's see. Yes, if you ever are in California, the Japanese American National Museum is in Los Angeles. It has obviously incredible displays, and of course, their camp for that area is Manzanar. Minidoka is probably doesn't have quite as much, but every year, that at least before the pandemic, there was a pilgrimage of Japanese Americans from the Puget Sound area to go out there to Idaho. I've never been able to make it, but because if you work in schools, it was always the last week in June, which we were trying to close down school. And so I could never make it. So one of these days, I said I would go and retired. And of course, pandemic hit. And so maybe next year, we'll see. Okay, I can see that it's 7:28. And is it time, Carson, for you to actually, on behalf of the museum, kind of acknowledge the presentation and all of our folks who are kind enough to show?
Yeah, I think that was also the last of our questions, so that worked out beautifully. But thank you so much for your presentation tonight. I know I enjoyed it and learned so much more about this topic than I had ever known before, and I know our audience enjoyed it a lot. Thank you all so much for joining us for our history talk. And just a reminder, our next history talk is going to be April 13th at 6:30 p.m. and registration links are available on our website as well as the City of Lacey's Facebook page. But thank you all for joining, and we hope to see you at our next history talk.